Hello, everybody, and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Tuesday, the 25th of February. Glad to see you. Um, a week or two ago, I was on a webinar listening to women in leadership roles talking about leading through times of crisis. Like, how do you maintain that? What are some tips around how do you deal with crisis? And one of the people, brilliant young woman. She runs the women's shelters, the women's shelters. Sorry, for women who are homeless or at risk of that they need safety precautions in London, Ontario, and she's got like seven different places that she takes care of and 100 employees and plus all the volunteers. And she said one of the things she realized is that you you need to plan for a crisis before the crisis. You really can't jump into the crisis and say, okay, so let's figure this out as we go. Now we all know that there is when a crisis happens, it's a crisis because we have never had to deal with it before, or we weren't expecting it, things like that. But there are things we can do to plan ahead. Things we can think, if this ever happened, what might we do? I remember back when I was still in the Diocese of Huron, so prior to 2008, and there was a threat of, we'd gone through the SARS virus, and our diocese recognized, the church in southwestern Ontario recognized that we really didn't know how to deal with something like that. Like, we shut things down in hospitals and you couldn't go and visit people, but we had no idea what we could do, nor do we have any idea what the churches could do, what they could offer. And so one of our priests who had worked in the hospital, Janet, she came up with a pandemic plan that all of the churches were to adapt for themselves, that they could figure out with their own context. What can the church do? Can we be a safe place? Can we be a gathering spot where people could come and find information and things like that? Not realizing that, 12 years later, in 2020, we'd be faced with a worldwide pandemic, and that all that information, well, all good information, only some of it could be used because we weren't using the church as a place to gather, were we? We were actually saying, stay home, don't come. So that was an interesting thing, sort of the plan for a crisis ahead of time. But the other thing that came out of this webinar was this whole idea that, like, these were fairly young women. I think one woman was probably in her very young, in her 50s, maybe 60s, but in her 50s at least. And two of the women were probably in their early 30s. And so was the facilitator, who's already a doctor, like a professor at the university, Huron University in London, Ontario. And one of the things that one of the young ladies mentioned, especially about being a woman in leadership, was imposter syndrome. And everybody was nodding their heads. Like the moderator and the other two panelists were like, yep, absolutely, imposter syndrome. And I got thinking about that in my own life and ministry and thinking, oh my heavens, that's right. And I never even realized it for so very long. That because I was raised the way I was, in the era that I was, in the environment that I was, that, I was taught from an early age that, I could go to university, I could be a priest. First women ordained priests in my diocese, my area, was when I was 5 years old. That was never really an issue that I couldn't be, practically speaking, but it was never really a given that I could be. Now, that sounds ridiculous because many women were ordained priests before I was. But the thing is, it was still difficult. We still have the glass ceiling. We still do. We still had this sense that um, men are born into these positions and women somehow have to work harder for them, which is hooey. We should all have to work hard for the positions that we have, especially when we have leadership. We need to own those. We need to work with integrity. But I realized when they mentioned imposter syndrome that I had that for a lot of years. I could stand up in front of my congregation or in front of my annual meeting and say, I am the priest. I am the one who is trained. I have gone to school. I am the person, as they say in the military, I'm the SME, the subject matter expert that you've chosen to be here. So don't second guess me because what I'm saying is true. We need to do this. And then I would sit down and put my hands on my lap underneath the table and I would shake, or I would go home. and I would just fall apart. Before I met Rob, before we got married, I would go home from meetings and I would be a ball of anxiety. I would be so anxious and so sure that people weren't listening to me, or who was I that they would listen to me? How crazy is that? That's the thing. I felt like an imposter. And then when I got married, I had somebody telling me I wasn't an imposter, but I'd come home and I'd like fall apart because, so and so. And usually, not always in my first parish, it was a woman, but usually there'd be a man in the group who would decide to take it upon himself to explain to me how wrong I was. Um, and the truth is, he would have done it to whoever was the priest, regardless of gender. But it really, I'd go home and tell Rob, and then Rob would lose his mind for him on my behalf, and that would calm me down because I'm trying to calm him down. But the thing is, I had to learn to own my role. And when I was elected bishop and came into this diocese of Brandon, it took me a while because there were some people who pushed back. People who's like, "You really don't know what you're doing, you little girl. Like just let me take care of that, or I'll tell you how to do that." Not many, just a couple people, but I learned pretty quickly, and I'll give God all the credit that in the consecration, when hands were laid upon my head and the Holy Spirit was prayed for and invoked into me, into who I am, something happened. I stopped feeling like an imposter most of the time. Now there are times when I'm like, I can't believe I'm doing this. I can't believe I'm the one that they want to stand up and say, do this. I can't believe that I need to do this. But most of the time, 80% of the time, the imposter syndrome has disappeared. I don't feel like it's something I need to worry about anymore. And I think that comes from simply owning the leadership, recognizing that I am in this role of leadership, or I am in this job that I have because I was appropriately and duly chosen. And trust has been placed in me, and now I need to own that trust. I need to live up to it. I need to live into it. And part of that means I have to have the maturity, the emotional and the professional maturity to recognize that I am not an imposter. I am not little 6-year-old Rachel Louise Walker who would one day grow up to become. No, I am the grown up Rachel Louise Parker, 8th Bishop of Brandon. But the truth is, you don't have to be bishop. Any position we are in, male, female, child, teenager, old person, seniors, elders, whatever we are, whatever position we are in, if we trust that we've landed there or been chosen or elected or we've chosen to be in a position, we need to own it. We need to be able to say to ourselves, I have the gifts I need to do this, or I'm capable of discovering and learning the gifts I need to do this. And when we get to that point where we give up the imposter syndrome, we give up this sense that I am doing this, but I probably shouldn't be, and somebody's going to find out about me and find out I'm a fraud. When we can let go of that and own the role we have, then the work gets done. The real honest to goodness work gets done because we're living into who we're called to be in that moment. Whoever you are and wherever you are, if you understand what I'm saying about imposter syndrome, then you've either lived through it or maybe you're still living through it right now. Ask God to help you get over that. Ask God to give you the gifts or the mentors or the alongsiders, those people who can come alongside you to help you to learn how to do whatever it is you're called to do right now. Because if you're called to do it, then you're not an imposter. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with what you are doing. The imposter syndrome thing completely comes from inside us. And that's something we really need to purge. So I encourage you today to get rid of the imposter syndrome if you've got it. And if you're blessed to not have it, keep an eye out for your colleagues or friends or people around you who might, and come alongside them and help them to own their role. Because imagine how powerful things could be changed if we all owned the responsibilities that we have and lived into them knowing that we ain't imposters. we're exactly where we're supposed to be. We could change the world, couldn't we? Have a great day. God bless you. And thank you for not being an imposter. I'll see you tomorrow.